Look Outreach is underwritten by the generous support of Munter Enterprises. Family owned and operated since 1972, integrity is important, as our family name is on every project. Our word is our bond. Munter Enterprises. Just build it.
Welcome back, everyone. Well, you know, there's an issue in the community regarding the Watershed Coalition. A lot of information about it, probably a lot of misinformation about it. And we've interviewed a couple of people to get some opinions, but it was really apparent that we had to reach out to John Strough, the supervisor of Queensbury, who could shed more light on this as playing a pivotal role in this whole process. So welcome, John. Very nice to have you here.
Well, thank you, Jesse.
And thanks for agreeing to come in.
Yes.
I think the best way to go about this is let's talk process. And that give our viewers, in case they don't know, just a little bit of the background. Way before you were involved, like 18 years before you were involved in 1999.
Well, the 3 years and some that I've been involved with the Lake George Watershed Collation, I have some documents that I've collected, organized, and put them in chronological order. Because this issue came up and I want to explain, you know, what happened.
Sure.
So one of the first things I have here is a letter to the Honorable D.N. Ream, who was supervisor of the town of Bolton.
It's 1999.
This is 1999,
yes, right.
And it's from the Secretary of State, Alexander Treadwell, saying that we would like to produce a plan that will produce an organization that will help coordinate the 9 municipalities, the Lake George Association, the Fund for Lake George, and the Lake George Park Commission, and the Darren Freshwater Institute, and the
There's
Lake George Land. Yes, to coordinate all of those organizations under one umbrella for the purpose of sharing thoughts, sharing cooperation, and moving forward in a more efficient manner with the idea that we want to protect Lake George's water quality.
Yeah, got it.
So
now,
this is 1999.
Now that's a state, by the way.
That's the Department of State that set this up.
The reason I mention that, that's an important distinction. The responsibility of this was not falling on any of the individual townships or municipalities. This was a state-driven concept.
That's right. And the state said that this organization will have a coordinator who will be under the Department of State and work with the Department of State. And here are the tasks given to the coordinator: coordinate and keep records, assure compliance with grant requirements, and keep accurate records of expenditures. Coordinator will report to the Department of State, who serves as chair of this committee. The Department of State will share as the chair of that organization. It became to be the Lake George Watershed Conference, which later
became the coalition.
Yeah, which became the Lake George Watershed Coalition. And the coordinator will report to the DOS, and the coordinator will serve, the DOS will serve as the chair. Okay, and the New York State, at the time, Secretary of State chairs the Lake George Conference.
Well, you know, John, thank you for sharing that, because the reason I think that's important is that the responsibility of this coordinator, this person answers to the state, and I had made notes on this also, to keep records, to oversee the activities, to make sure that they was compliant, and report to the State Department directly, correct?
That's correct.
Yes, okay. Now we fast forward, and we move into an era where there are grant proposals.
Yes, there was a multitude of grants.
Right.
And it was decided way back when, the early 2000s, that, you know, it wasn't fair for one municipality, let's say the village of Lake George, to sponsor all the grants. They were outreaching to see if there are other municipalities willing to share some of that burden of sponsoring the grants. So the town of Bolton, the village of Lake George, the town of Queensbury, all decided that, you know, for the benefit of Lake George, we'll sponsor the grants.
Now, could you just tell us what that means when you say you sponsor a grant?
Well, that means that we'll be writing the check after we got the documentation from the Department of State saying that it was okay to write the check.
Yes, right, sure.
Okay. And there's a whole process to that. Maybe we'll get into that, maybe we won't. But the idea is that these grants were to benefit all of Lake George. So some people think that since Queensbury sponsored the grant, that money should just go to Queensbury. That wasn't the way this was set up. We would sponsor the grant, take our turn, as well as the village of Lake George and the town of Bolton. But the grants were the benefit of the whole Lake George basin, with the idea of making sure that the water quality doesn't degrade.
Now, I want to just clarify one thing for our viewers, that grant proposal writing is a very complicated issue. Anybody that's been involved in it will know that it goes through numerous departments, numerous levels of approval, and numerous levels of compliance. So, and with Bolton Landing and Lake George and Queensbury willing to accept the responsibility, that opens up the second part of the conversation is, if you forward the money for any of this, how is that money reimbursed?
Well, we didn't. Queensbury, since 2006, we haven't forwarded any money.
You got it? Oh, okay.
Let me explain the process. Now, the grant administrator was the coordinator who, after they did request for qualifications, they hired Dave Decker to do this.
Right.
So Dave was, among many, many other things, doing good things for Lake George, but among the many things, he was administering the grants. So he would submit what they call a PR, a payment request. And the payment request was supposed to be, all right, I wish reimbursement for X amount of dollars. Here is the justification for it. Here is the in-kind, and so forth. So he would submit that, and then it would go through the Department of State gauntlet. The Department of State has several departments that would review this payment request. After it went through the Department of State gauntlet, then it would go to the comptroller's office.
Wow.
And if it passes, it passes the state, Department of State departments, and if it passes the comptroller's office, it came back to the Department of State for final approval. Once it got final approval, they would send something to the town or the village, whatever the entity was that was sponsoring the grant, and say it's okay to make payment to this entity or this person for this amount because it's been justified.
Got it. Now, this is actually a perfect place to stop part one of this interview, because in that, each one of the municipalities and also the grant writers, they're all subject to reviews periodically and sometimes audits, and that's what we will get into in part two of this interview. All right, John?
Okay, that's fine.
To see this part, you can head to our website, looktvonline.com.